I just watched All the Old Knives on Amazon. I'm gonna talk about it. Is that an expression? I don't know. Yeah, so before I get into actually talking about the movie itself, I want to talk about sort of what's going on behind the scenes because it's interesting. I will admit I don't know anything about the production. I'm just Googling stuff, but it's got a more different track record than a lot of movies, I feel like. I have been following this production company that makes these kind of movies. They also made The Counselor and Killing Them Softly, Tree of Life. And so they have a very specific style of movie that they make. I think they made, God, what was that movie? And so the director of All the Old Knives is this guy, Janis Metz, who looks like he's mostly a documentarian, but he did direct an episode of True Detective Season 2 and then a miniseries called 000 that I'm not familiar with. It'll be All the Old Knives. It's an adaptation of the book of the same name by Oleg Steinhauer, an American guy who's he's like a crime writer. He wrote The Tourist, but not the movie The Tourist. He wrote a different The Tourist, and then a different The Tourist got made with Johnny Depp. So I don't think they're the same thing. He did end up writing television. He wrote the show Berlin Station, which is on Epix, I guess. I've never heard of it. It's got pretty decent reviews, and he's got a writing credit on all of it. So it seems like he was the showrunner and also had a writing credit on all of it. So there is sort of a pedigree here. But he's known, the guy, Oleg, is known as like a crime writer specializing in like CIA stories. So before I actually Googled this guy, Oleg Steinhauer, I was going to do some version of the difference between writing novels and writing a movie, although there's a very rich history of novels being adapted into movies. And honestly, it's my opinion that a novel especially fits more efficiently into a television format because you have more time, but that's neither here nor there. But seeing that this guy wrote and was the showrunner for Berlin Station, that sort of blows up that whole point of view that I was going to do, except for the fact that he seems to have a gigantic, or at least in a rotating writing staff that he worked with. But of the, I think, 29 episodes, I think he has a written by credit on all 29 of his episodes of his show. So somehow he wrote those. This is all sounding condescending, and I do kind of want to get into that point, which is the dialogue in this movie, All the Old Knives, sort of, it's not the way people talk. Like, it's not a hard and fast rule that every movie and television show has to have dialogue that actually sounds like real people. It's a good way to go. It's a good way to operate, and I consider some of the better stuff that way. But yes, there are specific circumstances where you can have a movie or a television show where the dialogue is not how people talk, and it works for it. Yeah, so I guess I'll just start with the dialogue. The dialogue in this is kind of hard to understand, and it kind of exists somewhere in the realm between sort of Aaron Sorkin dialogue and Law and Order, where there's sort of like everybody has the same tempo and the same tone, the same monotone, and there's a lot of like very dense paragraphs that everybody's talking. And it's just kind of hard to follow because of the low-key deliveries, but also just the material itself. It's not, it isn't the way people speak, and that does sort of throw me off and trigger me a little bit. So when I'm saying Law and Order and Aaron Sorkin, not a compliment. And that's sort of my whole biggest complaint about the movie itself is you're kind of led by the nose through the whole thing, but because the dialogue is so confusing and because there's, I think, 4 or 5 time periods that they keep flashing between, Chris Pine and Tandy Newton and Lawrence Fishburne and the other guy and the other guy, I don't know, they're all flipping between these different time periods, and honestly, credit to the wig makers because they're crushing it. Not just Tandy Newton's wigs, but Chris Pine's like gray hair stuff. The best part, like, steals the show for sure, is Chris Pine's just weird hair. But yes, it's hard to follow because of the jumping back and forth, but also because so much of this movie is in dialogue. And I actually haven't read the book, but I assume that's because so much of the book exists in either Tandy Newton's or Chris Pine's, I'm not sure, head. It could be both. The movie sort of splits the difference, and sometimes it's from the perspective of Chris Pine, sometimes it's from the perspective of Tandy Newton. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that the book, it was internal monologue. And yeah, the number one rule in filmmaking is, internal monologues are useless because film is a cinematic medium. You need to show it. And so this movie sort of splits the difference a little bit in that there's a huge amount of dialogue sort of explaining what's going on. And part of that is actually a really good mechanic that they're using, which is it's an interview. Chris Pine is sent to go find Tandy Newton, to interview her, and to kind of give her last rites because she's the CIA spy that betrayed everybody. And he's trying to get her to confess 8 years later after it by talking about the events that took place. And so it's this conversation that's happening, which is really interesting, but it's also very, very confusing because it does kind of seem like one or both of them is lying, and it's unclear who's lying. And so as the story unfolds, you find out this was a lie. You find out this was a lie. There's a lot of like twists and double cross. I wouldn't call them like massive like M. Night Shyamalan twists, but it is a hard-boiled thriller, so you're not going to get a direct course of action, except for that's how it actually plays out is the direct course of action, because over the course of the interview, more information gets explained. There's weird challenges when you're adapting something that seems to be so based on data and based on paying attention to details, and then have that play out almost entirely in conversation. Honestly, now that I think about it, this movie might actually play out better as like a play instead of a teleplay or a movie, because every single scene is two characters meeting and then lying and dialogue and lying and dialogue, and then one goes off one way and one goes off the other way, and then you usually follow one and they go meet another character and they do the same thing. It's a lot of pairings, which again brings me back to Law and Order, where it's this pair talking, and then this person goes over here, and this pair talking, and then this person goes over here, and then everybody at the bullpen gets together, and the boss gives them the lecture, and they have the conversation, and then everybody, splits off, and then there's pairings again. There's a lot of that going on. Is that a trope of hard-boiled thrillers and noirs? I honestly don't know. I'm not an expert on noir, and I'm definitely not an expert on hard-boiled like detective novels, so I don't know. Yeah, so the runtime of this, it's saying it's an hour 41. So just barely more than an hour and a half, which is totally digestible. Netflix is doing this thing. Obviously, this is on Amazon. Netflix is doing this thing now where it has an entire box of movies that are 90 minutes or less, which I think is awesome, and I think is such a great way to go. This movie almost fits into that category, but the experience of it, because the pacing of the scenes, the pacing of the dialogue, there's so much of chewing the scenery. Chewing the wallpaper? Is that the phrase? I forget. But there's so much of just like these long pans across this beautifully shot. I gotta say, the cinematography, beautiful, very commercial. Not in how it's lit, but in the level of quality of putting things in front of the lens. So you're looking through wine glasses into the people, the tons and tons of lens flares. Every time there's a light in the scene, it's going right into the lens and it's blurring it out. Half the time, Tandy Newton and Chris Pine's face, either one of them is in total shadow and you can't really see them. Yeah, so it's really interesting cinematography. I wonder though, I saw it in standard dynamic range. If I had seen it in high dynamic range, I wonder if it would have been better. I honestly don't know, because a lot of stuff now in high dynamic range looks great, but then when you sort of mix it down into standard dynamic range, it doesn't translate correctly, and people's faces are so dark that there's no detail. This movie didn't really do that. This movie, half the face at all times was pretty much completely impossible to see. Like, you wouldn't even be able to see Chris Pine's like left eye for half this movie because the light in the interview is always on this side. It's a stylized choice. It didn't bother me. I thought the cinematography was quite beautiful. The story, best I can figure it, is this plane like 8 years ago got hijacked and is on a tarmac in Austria, and there's passengers that are being held as hostages, and there's terrorists, and they have this thing. And so the local CIA U.S. headquarters in the U.S. Embassy in Austria is trying to figure it out. And so Chris Pine and Tandy Newton and Lawrence Fishburne, and then the other guy with the goatee, they're all working out of this thing. But we know, because it's the future, that there was probably a mole and somebody ratted out on one of their contacts. So they're not actually trying to like actively SEAL Team 6 storm the plane. That's not their role. Their role is to reach out to their contacts and figure out who did it and try to talk them out of doing it somehow. And I get that that's actually probably a more realistic way of how hijackings and terrorist things work, but it does seem kind of muddled in that Chris Pine is this sort of suave debonair, meeting at coffee shops, drinking wine, like always wearing a scarf, like always looking very like, I'm happy to be in Austria kind of thing. But then the stakes are people getting killed in a plane parked on a landing strip. There's a lot of people running in and running out and going, I have to take this call. There's a lot of that because that's sort of the whole thing, because each call could be the critical thing that blah, blah, blah. And then narratively also, each call could be the critical piece of information that we need to know. Credit where credit's due. The big reveals that are actually satisfying come way at the end, but you have like, I don't know, an hour plus of this movie that you have to sit through in order to get to these actually interesting reveals. So I will say the second 2/3 of the movie, or the second half of the movie, very satisfying. It's just unfortunately the pacing up until that point. First of all, you don't have enough information to really go on other than a thing went wrong and it's probably Chris Pine's fault, and it's probably Tandy Newton's fault, and it's the bearded guy who obviously did it, and Chris Pine and Tandy Newton kind of agree that he probably did it. But because you're jumping back in time, it's weird to know where people's heads are at, if that makes sense. It's a weird narrative thing because there's definitely, you don't want to make the audience aware of all the information right up front, because otherwise then it's not a thriller. It's just a thing that happened. It's basically a recounting of events, a dramatic retelling, if you will. But because not only does the audience not have all the information, but the characters you're following are unreliable narrators. They're kind of lying about everything, and it's unclear whether they're lying for personal reasons or if they're lying because they're responsible for this CIA mistake that, has now in 8 years later commissioned Chris Pine to go find Tandy Newton and decide whether or not he's going to kill her because she's the mole. It's unclear, and it remains unclear for like a problematic amount of time. Which kind of gets me into the problem with the whole novel situation. A novel, it needs to be as big or as small as it needs to be. A screenplay, you're a hack if you just follow the beats by beats, end of act one, midpoint, low point, blah, blah, blah. But also you can't have a movie that is 60 minutes of just absolute, just chewing the scenery and eye contact and people drinking in a place in Calabasas or whatever the heck they were at. And then the rest of the movie being this, really, really posh, like European thriller where people in trench coats are walking in alleys and making deals, and Tandy Newton is definitely banging Chris Pine, but Chris Pine seems ambivalent about it. And then also, like he has glowing eyes, but for some reason her eyes don't glow. It's very, it was very pretty. The actors in it are very pretty. I would argue Chris Pine, who I don't consider the best looking guy, but a good looking guy, looks absolutely stunning in this movie. And then Tandy Newton is obviously like a supermodel, so no problem there. Lawrence Fishburne looks beautiful, even though the wig guy had, nothing to do with him, except for maybe the goatee. I don't know. When I watched this movie, it's not a laundry folding movie. You have to actually be completely zoned in and paying attention and trying to listen to the dialogue. I regret not putting on closed captioning. A thing I've been doing lately is just because either I'm going deaf or the sound mixes of movies have been getting way worse in the last couple of years, but I've been putting on closed captioning and that's made a huge difference. The problem is they go through so much dialogue. I'm not even sure if I read the closed captioning that I would be able to pay attention to the scene because there's just so much material going on dialogue wise. And the scenes are very, 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 designed, I guess. I wouldn't say, I think cinematic's a bad word. And they're not doing what Spielberg does, which is Spielberg does this thing where he like makes your eye track where it's going. Like if something's over here in one scene, the smash cut's going to leave it there. So you don't have to be searching for it in the next scene. It's all this like intuitive, like non-verbal stuff. That was not happening usually. It was kind of just like big, dolly shot, slider shot going through the room, and they're having this conversation, and then you just keep going, and wine bottles and all this stuff. And sure, that's fine, and that's like what Dateline is trying to strive to become. I don't know. It was a lot. It was extremely stylized, which, again, these kind of movies are extremely stylized. That's important. That's an important aspect of the storytelling. Did it add to the quality of it? Ironically, I enjoyed the movie. If I had stopped at the halfway point, I would have definitely said this movie was boring and slow and didn't make a whole lot of sense. And if you're going to have a beer and try to watch it, you're going to turn it off immediately because it's too dark. The dialogue is impossible to follow. And it's really unclear as to what's going on and who's lying, other than the fact that everybody lies. Because apparently in hard-boiled thrillers, everybody lies. But yeah, if you stay to the end, I think you will be satisfied. It has a really great set of payoffs. There's, actual acting happening, which is great. I saw Chris Pine was one of the executive producers on it. Makes sense. Actor sort of in an advanced stage of their career, not an old actor necessarily, but an actor who has the ability to sort of vet scripts. John Krasinski and Emily Blunt are good examples of this with the Silence movies, which I don't remember what they're called. I don't know. It's definitely not a blockbuster. It's not trying to be a blockbuster. It's very stylized. It's very posh. It's very European. It's very slick. It's just, I wish the writing was up to the quality of the visuals and the acting. And I don't know. It's weird because usually you can see writing problems in the pacing of the scenes too. And there wasn't any of that. It was edited quite well. It's just that the dialogue itself is just tough to sift through. I don't know, like keeping 3 or 4 different ideas in my head while I'm watching a movie at all times to try to, solve the mystery. I'm not very good at, just because my attention span sucks. But this movie, I don't know, like 8 details that you have to figure out. And yes, to its credit, it does solve all of that quite satisfyingly, actually. And there's a really great twist at the end. But you got to hang in there. I'm glad I didn't do this on the elliptical, because I would have definitely like burned out and passed out and taken a shower and come back and been like, where am I? I still have 30 minutes left, and we're still on the tarmac, literally. I don't know. It is what it is. It's pretty. It's a movie. It feels like a movie. It acts like a movie. It has acting at a pretty high quality. Maybe I'm just too much of a rube, and maybe I'm too much of a stickler for dialogue that makes sense. Credit where credit's due. I might actually look up Berlin Station and try to watch it, because this guy seems to be the real deal. I just, it's a I didn't get it situation. Like the polite thing to say when you don't like a movie, without saying the movie sucks, because there's a difference between you don't like a movie and the movie sucks. The Room, the movie sucks. Pineapple Express, don't like the movie. I don't know. This really wasn't for me. I mean, I don't know. I would say go see it, but then the more that I think about it, if you sit through an hour, it's going to be a tough sell to sit through the next 42 minutes or whatever. It really is. You have to want to be there. And as someone who has a bad habit lately of hitting pause to go do other things, this movie does not cater to that at all. This is one of those have to sit in the theater and ride it out like the crowd. And the fact that it is distributed on Amazon, I don't know. That seems like a weird choice. It's not a tentpole property, which means it's kind of original material, which I really like. It looks and acts like a movie, which I really appreciate, and it's got really fantastic acting. So if those are the things that are checking your boxes, yeah, go for it. I can't really go into the most details of the movie because, first of all, I didn't understand a lot of it. And second of all, if you actually write down what happens, it's very simple and very obvious. Memento kind of does this. This isn't Memento. There's no black and white situation, but it does sort of have the same writing style as Memento, where if you actually line up the timeline correctly, it's a very simple story. It's just because they chopped it up the way they did, it becomes confusing by design. It's a way to make movies, and it's not a traditional, blockbuster style of writing, and I can respect that. Yeah, so that's it. Oh, this is going to be a nightmare to cut together. It's not even the ums this time. It's just the fact that I just, every sentence becomes a paragraph tangent, and I just don't expect this to be sewing together very efficiently. We'll see.